Tech and clips.
Yeah. Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Philip. This is Philiminizzy Reacts. So yeah, you guys already know we've been doing reactions to music, by the Beatles. To me it's like they're like the one of the greatest bands, of all time. But at some point they broke up, and personally I don't know why. So today we're gonna check out this video of why the Beatles broke up. I'm not too sure why, but we're about to find out. Shout out to, Donna Billadu for sending me this video. So guys, before we even begin, make sure to like this video, comment, share all the good stuff, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Let's dig right in, guys.
Why did the Beatles break up?
Okay.
Why does anyone break up? Infidelity, finances, personal differences?
Yeah, that's
or
true.
sometimes we just drift apart. When I was younger, I was convinced it was Yoko Ono's doing. It was in articles, television. It became one of the first memes I ever saw about my favorite band.
Okay, so I know at some point, the John Lennon, was hanging out with Yoko Ono more, and with the little information that I have, the other band members, I think they didn't like it. I'm not too sure, because he was showing up with her in their studio sessions, and like there was this narrative that she kind of took John Lennon's attention from the band. He was a bit distracted. That was kind of like the information I also got. But let's continue. Please confirm that if that's true down in the comment section. Let's continue, guys.
She's awful. She's terrible.
She can't sing.
I love her.
But that never sat right with me. How could one person upend years of professional friendship?
Yeah.
Surely, this story has more nuance, emotional complexities, and creative difficulties than that. And it does. Breakups can be messy, and often they aren't sparked by just one thing. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr formed the most celebrated band in human history, but even that couldn't keep them together. You know how this story ends, but I'm going to show you why.
All right, let's dig right in. Anyway, guys, shout outs to the channel, James Maharaj, for putting this together, man.
Can you believe we only had the Beatles for 8 years after Ringo joined in 1962?
Whoa.
And in those 8 years, they gave us over 200 songs, like Hey Jude and A Day in the Life. And by their publicly announced breakup in 1970, the lads from Liverpool had changed the world of music forever. But to understand the beginning of the breakup, we have to go back, way back, to when they stopped touring. Okay. For any aspiring rock star, having thousands of fans screaming your name sounds like a fantasy. Yeah. But the reality for the Beatles was utterly miserable. During the height of Beatlemania in 1966, the fans were screaming so loudly during live performances that Ringo had to look at the other members' shoulder movements in order to follow a song, because they were unable to actually hear themselves playing over the clamor, making the thing they loved, their music, sound subpar to them. Ringo says, "We used a house PA with those huge amps, and I had to watch the back of the boys because I couldn't hear nothing, and this is really my opinion, we really weren't playing great." John Lennon and George Harrison were actually becoming fed up with touring. George most notably recalls a dangerous situation in August 20th, 1966, where the band was to perform at Crosley Field in Cincinnati, but had to call it off due to rain. George blames the venue for its poor planning. George says, "Cincinnati was an open-air venue, and they had a bandstand in the center of the ballpark with a canvas top on it. It was really bad weather, pouring with rain, and when Mal Evans got there to set up their equipment, he said, 'Where's the electricity feed?' And the fella said, 'What do you mean electricity? I thought they played guitars.' He didn't even know we played electric guitars. It was so wet that we couldn't play. They brought in the electricity, but the stage was soaking, and we would have been electrocuted, so we canceled. The only gig we ever missed." But here's the rub. George, Ringo, and John were already getting fed up with touring, but not Paul. He still needed some convincing. And as you'll see, this is an important piece of foreshadowing to their disbanding. Paul believed touring and playing live was integral to the band's success and growth, saying, "Touring's good and it keeps us sharp. We need touring and musicians need to play. Keep music live." But after canceling the rainy Cincinnati performance on August 20th, the band rescheduled for the next day, made the show, and then traveled 350 miles to St. Louis for another show that same day at 8:30 in the evening. And it was still raining. This harrowing trip sealed the deal for Paul to stop touring. He says, "It was worse than those early days, and I don't even think the house was full. After the gig, I remember us getting in a big, empty, steel-lined wagon, like a removal van. There was no furniture in there, nothing. We're suddenly sliding around in the back of the van, and it was like, oh, fuck this. And finally, the guys, John and George, had been a little, murmur about touring. And finally, all of us were like, fuck this. So that was the moment." Instead of causing a big commotion with an official announcement, the band agreed to simply say nothing, finished their scheduled 1966 tour, and added no new dates until people realized they had no intention of getting back on the road. Now, this decision can be argued to be pretty great, seeing that they flourished in the recording studio. Without having to perform their songs live, they could take more chances musically, which is quite evident in albums like Sgt. Pepper's. However, the decision to stop playing live comes only 4 years before their official breakup, and it seems Paul still had a soft spot for live performance, and John, George, and Ringo didn't have it as much. This small difference proved to be a part of the bigger picture in terms of breakup. Hear this quote by John, and I think you'll see what I mean. John says, "I was thinking, well, this is the end, really. There's no more touring. That means there's going to be a blank space in the future. That's when I really started considering life without the Beatles. What would it be? And that's when the seed was planted that I had to somehow get out of the Beatles without being thrown out by the others. But I could never step out of the palace because it was too frightening." So in John Lennon's own words, the Beatles stopping touring played a pivotal role in him thinking about leaving. After they finished touring, the Beatles took a 3-month hiatus in August 1966. John went off to film a role in the anti-war comedy How I Won the War in Spain between September and October, and began to write the song Strawberry Fields Forever. And although it's credited to Lennon and McCartney, it was for argument's sake mostly written by John. Not the first time he had written a song without Paul, but their songwriting split was definitely happening at this point. John then meets Yoko at her art exhibit in early November that year, and they began to get to know each other while he was still with his wife, Cynthia. Later that November, the band gets to work on their first recording session since Revolver. At this point, since they stopped touring, and Brian Epstein informed EMI that they wouldn't be releasing any new music for the Christmas market, the press began to take the group's lack of activity as a sign that they were on the verge of splitting up. So when news broke that they were back in the studio, it hit the front page. The Beatles were back as they began to create Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a novel concept album idea by Paul McCartney. Paul wanted distance from their original image. Paul says, "I thought, let's not be ourselves. Everything about the album will be imagined from the perspective of these people. So it doesn't have to be us. It doesn't have to be the kind of song you want to write. It could be the song they might want to write." John and George reportedly had doubts about Paul's make-believe scenario, but neither had an alternative idea for showcasing the new music. So they went with Paul. This created a strange new dynamic in the band. Paul leading the way even had engineer Jeff Emmerich calling him the band's de facto producer, giving him an upper hand in the Beatles. Even Ringo started to notice a divide brewing. Ringo says, "Sgt. Pepper was our grandest endeavor, a lot of leeway to come up with ideas and to try different material. John and Paul would write songs at home usually, or wherever they were, and bring them in and say, 'I've got this.' The actual writing process was getting to be separate by now, but they'd come in with bits and help each other, and we'd all help. John, Paul, and George, the writers, were putting whatever they wanted on the tracks, and we were spending a long time in the studio. We were still recording the basic tracks as we always did, but it would take weeks to do the overdubs for the strings or whatever, and the percussion would be overdubbed later and later. Sgt. Pepper was great for me because it's a fine album, but I did learn to play chess while we were recording it. Chess is fun, but I imagine making music would have been more fun for poor Ringo. We saw where John first thought he might actually want to leave, but this quote here by George Harrison about the arduous process of recording Sgt. Pepper's, I believe shows where he began to consider the end of the band. George says, I felt we were just in the studio to make the next record, and Paul was going on about this idea of some fictitious band. That side of it didn't really interest me, other than the title song and the album cover. It was becoming difficult for me because I really wasn't into it. Okay. Up to that time, we had recorded more like a band. We would learn the songs and then play them. Sgt. Pepper was the one album where things were done slightly differently. A lot of the time, it ended up just being Paul playing the piano and Ringo keeping the tempo, and we weren't allowed to play as a band so much. It became an assembly process, just little parts and then overdubbing, and for me it became a bit tiring and a bit boring. I had a few moments in there that I did enjoy, but generally I didn't really like making that album much. After what had happened in 1966, everything else seemed like hard work. It was a job, like doing something I really didn't want to do, and I was losing interest in being fab at that point. Everybody else thought that Sgt. Pepper was a revolutionary record, but for me, it was just not as enjoyable as Rubber Soul or Revolver, purely because I had gone through so many trips on my own that I was growing out of that kind of thing. Okay. Despite the issues with making the album, Paul's idea turned into a massive success. Sgt. Pepper spent a whopping 27 weeks at #1 on the UK charts and 15 weeks at #1 in the US after its release in May 1967. So it was worth it, wasn't it? Well, it seems the damage had already been done. We have John and George already contemplating the end of the band, and Ringo is tired of playing chess. All the while, Paul is growing ever more confident in his abilities. But here's where the catalyst comes, a huge, shocking moment. Brian Epstein dies. In August 1967, their longtime manager and friend Brian Epstein was found dead in London after an unintentional drug overdose. John was at a loss. He says, I knew that we were in trouble. I didn't really have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music, and I was scared. I thought, we fucking had it. The next year, February 1968, the Beatles go on a retreat to Rishikesh, India, to study transcendental meditation with the Maharishi. And John says, although I was meditating about 8 hours a day, I was writing the most miserable songs on earth. So when they returned to London, John decided to abandon Cynthia and begin a serious relationship with Yoko Ono, escaping the bore of his domestic life. This is where the part everyone knows comes in. John starts bringing Yoko to the recording studio. Now, before I continue, after seeing everything in this video leading up to her involvement, doesn't it already seem like some members want out? John saying the seed had already been planted after stopping touring, and George saying that he was tired of being fab. However, her presence didn't really help. The Beatles rarely allowed guests into the studio, and if anyone outside of them were to give input, at best it would be George Martin or Geoff Emerick. But John decided to bring Yoko in as a collaborator in 1968 while they began working on the White Album. Yoko would sit on the studio floor talking to John in a low voice and basically shadow to him everywhere he went. Then, the unthinkable. While they were working on a song, Yoko gave John advice on a vocal. The room fell silent. Paul says, fuck me. Did somebody speak? Who the fuck was that? Did you say something, George? Your lips didn't move. We are getting into it now. But here's the thing. John wanted her there. He asked her to be there, Yoko says. He wanted me to be part of the group. He created the group, so he thought the others should accept that. I didn't particularly want to be part of them. So whose fault is that? Yoko's? John wanted her there. But it doesn't help also that John and Yoko were both now doing heroin. John and Paul barely composed together. George was coming into his own, even to the point that he brought Eric Clapton in to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Geoff Emerick quits working with the Beatles because of their nasty behavior. Even Ringo wanted to quit now, saying, I had definitely left. I couldn't take it anymore. There was no magic and the relationships were terrible. I knew we were all in a messed up stage. It wasn't just me. The whole thing was going down. Ringo went to John's apartment and told him, I'm leaving the group because I'm not playing well and I feel unloved and out of it. And you three are really close. John replied that he felt the same way. Ringo went off on holiday, and even though the end was near, the boys sent him a telegram saying, you're the best rock and roll drummer in the world. Come on home. We love you. They were still like brothers, weren't they? Despite it all. But it wouldn't last. This is where it gets really messy. In 1968, the Beatles launched their new record label, Apple, and after a slew of issues with Yoko, where George Harrison had become fed up with her equal input, got into a fight with John, some say it turned physical, George walks out saying, "I'm out of here, put an ad in the papers and get a few people in, see you around the clubs." John chose to be a jerk and started to play The Who's A Quick One while he's away to mock George, and even suggested replacing him with Eric Clapton. They reconciled with George under new terms, and while filming the end of Let It Be, they played their last live concert on that infamous rooftop. They smiled, they played. It was one of the best live performances in music history, hands down. But it was all about to end. Apple was bleeding money to the point when an accountant quit, he left a memo saying, "Your personal finances are in a mess." The Beatles realized they needed a new manager as they were not adept at finances. Paul decided that his wife, Linda Eastman's father, and her brother would be perfect for the job as they were New York attorneys specialized in artist representation. But the rest of the band was like, hell no, thinking it would be a terrible idea to have Paul's in-laws overseeing their business. I mean, there is a saying, never mix money and family.
Yeah, true.
Enter the accountant, Alan Klein. A man Brian Epstein wouldn't even shake the hand of, and Mick Jagger, who Klein managed for a time, wrote a note to Paul about him saying, "Don't go near him." Klein wanted in on the Beatles for a while, and now he had his chance. 2 days before the rooftop concert, Klein met John and Yoko, charming them with his knowledge of the Beatles' catalog, and won them over. Klein was a brutish businessman. When Paul had brought Linda's father and brother to a meeting with Alan Klein, Klein turned it into a shouting fest until Paul and his in-laws left the meeting. Despite this, John convinced George and Ringo that Klein was the man for the job, George saying, "We favored people who were street people." But there was no time left to debate. The Beatles lost the right to Northern songs because they couldn't take over Brian Epstein's former management firm after he died. Paul eventually couldn't fight the rest of the band anymore and agreed to have Klein manage them, but refused to put his signature on Klein's contracts. Paul not signing actually ended up being a very good move, but we'll get back to that. The Beatles released Abbey Road in September 1969, while still playing more and more apart, and John and Yoko had performed live with another group that included Eric Clapton. This must have emboldened him with the confidence to do what he did next. During a meeting with Klein, soon after that performance, Paul says they should go back to performing live. Remember how Paul said 3 years earlier, touring's good and it keeps us sharp.
Yeah.
We need touring and musicians need to play, keep music live. Well, this is what John had to say to him. "I think you're daft. I wasn't going to tell you, but I'm breaking the group up. It feels good. It feels like a divorce." The room once again fell silent. Paul said everyone's jaws dropped. After the meeting where Klein convinced John not to go public with his leaving for marketing reasons, John and Yoko went into their car. Yoko recalls saying, "We went off into the car, and he turned to me and said, 'That's it with the Beatles. From now on, it's just you. Okay?' I thought, my God, those three guys were the ones entertaining him for so long. Now I have to be the one to take the load."
Yeah.
You know, the more and more I say all of this, the more and more I feel like Yoko got thrown under the bus. I mean, what do you think? Because obviously her presence in the recording studio was annoying, but
True.
there was a lot more going on to
True.
consider.
Yeah.
However, this destroyed Paul. He said, "John's in love with Yoko, and he's no longer in love with the three of us." Paul began to drink all day, stopped writing music. He was depressed until his wonderful wife Linda spoke to him, saying, "You don't have to take this crap. You're a grown man."
Yeah.
With her encouragement, Paul began to work on his first album as a solo artist. He called John in March 1970 and told him he was leaving the Beatles. However, Let It Be was about to be released, and Klein and the rest of the band didn't want Paul to release his debut album in April, as he initially planned, to allow room for the Beatles album. They sent Ringo to explain this to Paul, and after a huge argument, Paul kicked Ringo out of his house. Ringo felt terrible and convinced John and George to let Paul keep his original release date. But Paul did something no one expected. He publicly announced he was leaving the Beatles with a self-interview accompanying his debut album. John was pissed, saying, "I wanted to do it. I should have done it. I was a fool not to do it, not to do what Paul did, which was use it to sell a record. I started the band. I disbanded it. It's as simple as that." Paul responded, "I think it's just straightforward jealousy. Ringo left first, then George, then John. I was the last to leave. It wasn't me." That wasn't it for Paul. He was a man on a mission. Not only did he use the breakup to boost sales of his solo album, but he turned his sights on Alan Klein. Paul wanted to be done with Apple. He didn't want to have anything to do with Alan Klein. Paul calls George to say he wants off the label, to which George replies, "You stay on the fucking label. Hare Krishna." He reached out to John, but to no avail. Paul threatened to sue, and Alan Klein laughed at him. But they couldn't stop Paul. Paul sued. Paul won. It also helped that Paul never signed Alan Klein's documents. Later, the rest of the band would actually sue Alan too, admitting that Paul was probably onto something. And Klein actually ended up going to jail for fraud. A real piece of work, wasn't he? All four Beatles would never play again together, but each created a successful career for themselves. In the end, after all the dust settled, they only seemed to have love for one another. They mourned for one another. They would always still be the Beatles. Breakups rarely have just one cause, but in this case, there were four. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I actually learned a ton making this, and it even inspired me to make a breakup song. I call this one, "You Should Leave This Unread." See you next time.
Okay, is that a breakup song?
You should leave this unread. I'm aware that it's late for a message. I admit I hesitate and regret it, considering how elusive closure can be. You should leave this unread. This one's just for me. You know I try to move on. You know I try to find a way to erase you. I'd imagine that you were something so cruel, but honestly you were good for me, and I caused you so much grief. You should leave this unread. I am no relief. You know that when I wake up I forget where we are, like we had made it this far, like it wasn't the end, just a part. You know it could be a glimpse into another you and me, but even so it isn't real, just a thought in my head. And you should leave this unread. I should go off to bed, rise and try to sleep and recover, hoping nothing that I said was delivered. But you know that I must fix it all till it's broken. You should leave this unread, just so it ends. You know that when I just closed my eyes, I had a vision of you walking beside me, making funny face, and I just smiled. You know it could be a glimpse into another you and me, but even so it isn't real, just a thought in my head. If you enjoy these videos and want to support the channel, please consider becoming a patron. My videos will always be free, and this is a great way to help me make them better for you. Check out my debut album, The Hollyhobs, on Spotify and Apple Music, and click the like button, subscribe, and notification bell, because that is the best way to get notified when a new video is released. See you next time.
All right, guys. So yeah, why the Beatles broke up? I mean, this was a very insightful video, by this man James Maharaj. Yeah, shout outs to him, guys. Yeah, I mean the Beatles. You guys already know, one of the most influential and beloved bands, in music history. Officially disbanded, in 1970. Based off this video, making the end, of an era. The breakup, of the Beatles, has been the subject, of much speculation, analysis, and discussion over the years. I have to say, like I said, I had my own narrative. Fact that I mean, John bringing Yoko Ono was the reason why they broke up. But I mean, after watching this video, I feel like it goes in deep, But yeah, I mean, I feel like they broke up, based off of numerous factors, contributing to their dissolution. After watching this video, I picked up a few points, that I feel like led to their breakup. First off, creative differences. As the members of the Beatles, matured, I feel like their individual, artistic visions, began to diverge. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr all had different musical interests, and directions they wanted to pursue. I feel like the divergence was particularly evident in their later albums, where the collaborative spirit of their early work gave way to more individualistic projects. Yeah. Secondly, I have to say, I mean, leadership and control. Paul McCartney's increasing dominance in the band's creative process, I feel like led to tensions with John Lennon, who felt sidelined. Basically, I feel like Paul McCartney's drive to keep the band productive often clashed with John Lennon's more laid back approach, and growing interest in avant-garde music. Yeah. Thirdly, George Harrison's frustration. I feel like George Harrison's dissatisfaction, with his limited role, in the band, I feel like also contributed to the breakup. Despite his talents, George Harrison struggled, to get his songs included, on the Beatles albums. Leading to frustration and desire, to pursue a much more a solo career, basically, where he could, have more creative freedom. Yeah. Fourth point that I picked up was Ringo Starr's this content. I feel like although Ringo Starr often served, as the peacemaker within the group, even he grew discontented, with the escalating conflicts, and walked out, during the recording of their, of the White Album, though he eventually returned. Yeah, I feel like also that also led to the breakup, and I mean, external pressures, personal lives. I feel like also led to, led to the breakup. By external pressures and personal life. I mean, Brian Epstein's death, business disputes, and finally, Yoko Ono's presence. All these factors I feel like led to the breakup of the Beatles, which was very very sad, man. Like, yeah, those are the few points that I was able to gather from this video. But I have to say this was a very 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 insightful video, and I'm happy to have watched it. It clears a whole lot of narrative that had I personally had in mind. So yeah, shout outs to dell'abate, guys. Let me know, guys, your thoughts about this video down in the comment section. Let me know if you want us to continue doing reactions to more of this kind of content. Please let me know down in the comment section. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to like the video, give it a thumbs up, comment, share, all the good stuff. If you stuck with me to the end of the video, I know this was this was a lengthy one. If you stuck with me to the end of the video, you are very much loved, very much appreciated on here. More reactions such as this on the way. So stay tuned. My name is Philip, and also the next video reactions. Take care, stay safe, peace out.